when we first started, the idea of a branded podcast was very new. And so we spent a ton of time educating the market. So, it wasn't just sales, it was sales plus like a full education on what exactly a podcast is.
Welcome to the Digital Agency Growth Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Englander. So today on the show, I'm very excited to welcome Roger Nairn. Roger is the CEO of JAR Podcast Solutions. They help brands turn podcasts into real business results, which I am a big believer in, having a podcast for years and going through the ups and downs of building it. So I definitely see the value. And they're focused not just on downloads or side projects that go nowhere, but building content that's actually landing actual conversations and producing real results. They've worked with the likes of Amazon, Lululemon, Amex, Cirque du Soleil, great Canadian company that us Americans actually know. So that's awesome.
A couple.
So yeah, probably others that I'm blanking on. So Roger, great to have you on the show.
Thanks so much, Dan. Appreciate it.
For sure. Before we put on the recorder, you mentioned you have a very unique origin story. So let's just get right into it.
Yeah, well, I spent 20 plus years in the advertising world. I was on the client service side of things. Absolutely love agency life, but started to get, quite, I guess, disillusioned with the actual sort of advertising side of it all. This was around when, programmatic was starting to come in. Creativity was, less and less of an interest of our clients. It was more about, the ones and zeros, and budgets started to decrease. And, So when I fell in love with podcasting, which I did as just a hobbyist, I met a couple people, and we started to go out for beers together. We started to sort of fantasize over what a business could be like working together. And that's where this idea of creating our own creative agency around podcasts came to be. But I had tried, starting businesses in the past, and quite frankly, I would do anything to actually start them. I would spend a year thinking about what the name's going to be or what the business cards are going to look like, but I wasn't actually putting together a business plan. And so I said to these guys, listen, I've been down this road before. Unless we can just, start with the baby steps and put, an idea of what the company is out there and see if there's at least any interest, I'm not really interested in doing this. So we agreed. And that night I went home and I sent 10 messages to people on LinkedIn, literally just with a little paragraph of the type of company we were looking to start it. And I asked sort of like, is this of any interest to you? And the second person who responded said, no, this is not of interest to me, but it is an interest of my wife's. Well, it turns out his wife was the head of digital marketing for a company called Sage Natural Wellness, which is pretty much the world's largest aromatherapy company. And they have a lot of retail locations, a lot of online business. And I got to talking to her online, and she said, can you be in our office on Thursday? Well, this was on a Sunday when I had sent this. And yeah, sure, we'll be there on a Sunday. Or we'll be there on Thursday. Didn't have a name, didn't have a business plan, had no clue how to price anything. It literally was just a nugget of an idea. Walked into their boardroom confidently, sort of. Had this great discussion about a podcast idea that they have. And next thing you know, they said, great, send us an estimate. Again, no idea about pricing, any idea what to do. We literally wandered around the neighborhood. It was in sort of the Chinatown area of Vancouver, and went home that evening, put together an estimate, sent it their way. They signed it the next day, and it was our very first client. We used that money to sustain ourselves a little bit. Our next client after that was Lululemon. Our third client after that was Expedia. It just literally took off from there. So if there's anybody out there who's looking to start an agency, just start. Find a way to just start, and you'd be surprised what happens.
Yeah. Kind of looking back with some hindsight, what do you think was right about the offer and the timing to make things hit back then?
I mean, part of it was you have to remember, this was still in the early days of podcasting, with brands. This was 9 years ago, when podcasts were still a little bit of a gimmick. But we went in with a business point of view where it was about the business and how this podcast is going to impact it, versus sort of your brand needs a podcast and this is going to be fun. And, kind of like what social media was, 20, 30 years ago, where it was like something we had to do because everyone else was doing it. we took it from the standpoint of how this is going to help the business, which in their case they were looking to engage with a specific audience, and the podcast was designed for them. And I think it was that language plus the ability to actually project manage it and provide client service around it that was huge for them. And it's actually the model that we've lived with for the last 8 years.
Yeah, that's great. And can you talk about like how did things go from there? So you win this initial client. How did you start to expand this and grow the agency?
Yeah, so there was 3 of us when we started. It was the original JAR in JAR Audio, which was our original name, and we started to break ourselves out into specific specialties. My partner Jen was focused on the creative. My partner Aaron was focused on the technical side of it, and I was focused on the strategy, marketing, and the sales side of it. Where we really started to scale was when I decided I needed sales support so that I could put systems in place for the business to actually run. And it's no offense to my partners, but they just were not the system type people. And so we hired a salesperson. And I'll be perfectly honest, in hindsight, this was incredibly important from a scale standpoint. It actually turns out that the deal we put together was just horrific, and actually in hindsight, was a big blow to us financially. I offered the guy, he offered 25% plus salary. And I, for some reason at the time, looked at my partners and said, well, this is 25% of nothing right now. We had no clue what this company was going to be still. And so we put together this deal, which, it was a lot of money. That being said, we would never have scaled if it wasn't for him. So it was the ability. I think it was, one of the most important things was recognizing that you can't do it all, and taking a chance on bringing somebody in to help support you. And if it wasn't for that, we would have put the systems in place to be able to take on more than one client at a time. Those systems allowed us to take on, I think at one point we were 5 or 6 projects at a time. And each one was unique, but each one had, systems behind it in order to, at least, keep our sanity and keep us on track.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Can you dig further into those systems? So when you say systems in the early days, and maybe you can talk about how they evolve, like what did those sales systems look like?
Yeah, the systems for us was, well, first of all, we mapped out what we thought was going to be the ideal, customer journey or client journey, and we documented it. It was meant as a way to, if there's a book, I'm sure a lot of your folks out there who are listening have read Scaling Up. Incredible book, and it was that book that actually got me thinking about what it takes to scale. So we documented all of our processes. We documented every sort of stage. The other thing we did was we put together what we call, at the time we called the 8 Ps, and essentially all that was we broke down each sort of major step in our process into a name. We gave it a name, like prepare and plan and produce and post-production and promote. And, it seemed kind of gimmicky, but it was also little milestones that every project went through, no matter how unique and different the actual end result was. It still had to go through the pre-production stage and the production stage and post-production. And it was that, so that, we developed an internal language, but also it gave me the ability to go to one of my partners, who was our creative director, and say, Lululemon is in the pre-production stage, therefore you need to do X, Y, Z. Expedia is in the promote stage, so we need to put together their plan. So it gave us that sort of I don't want to use the word modular, but it it kind of was modular in a way, even though the end result was completely different, client to client.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I want to keep going down that road in a second, in terms of like productizing, or maybe that's the wrong word, but scaling out a particular service. But I do want to circle back to the sales hire, because I think a lot of agencies listening, maybe they're busy, they're overwhelmed, agency owners, they are thinking about hiring a salesperson and they're like, okay, Roger did it. And although the deal wasn't ideal, it allowed them to scale and kind of like get a lot of stuff off their plate and hit these wins. But a lot of the times, like what I hear probably like 90% of the time is we hired the salesperson, massive waste of money. They didn't get us anything. And so I'd love to understand that better. Like, what was it that this person was doing and like what worked about hiring this person? Maybe you got lucky or maybe you planned for it.
Yeah, it was really interesting because, and this is sort of a theme that we found a lot in our hiring across the board, was that, nobody really at the time had much experience in podcast sales, let alone branded podcast sales. And I mean, yes, there was people selling ad space on podcasts, but that's very, very different than selling an entire production, an entire show. In a lot of ways you're selling, you're like you're selling like a broadcast, it's like an entertainment salesperson. So, our salesperson that we brought in was skilled in work in his actual passion was working with startups, but specifically startups in emerging industries. He had a lot of different tech experience in VR and AR and all these different spaces that were emerging. And so when he came to us, he first of all had when we sort of mutually, agreed on things, he had a real passion for the podcast industry, but also really understanding sort of where this is all going to go. And quite frankly, we didn't know ourselves. So it was, we had a vision of what we wanted to be, but, if you follow the podcast industry at all, it changes daily, it seems. So, but he saw it as a true, strong offer long-term. And so he was able to create the value proposition for our clients in a way that they could also see the vision of where this industry was going. So they got to be on the bleeding edge of, they got to be at the early days of social. They got to be at the early days of, programmatic advertising sort of thing. And that was attractive for a lot of brands, but also there was a real sort of pull towards like, hey, you want to be the first in market versus your competitors, right? Like you want to own podcasting in your category. And then on top of that, he was really, really great at just outreach, like cold outreach. We had a list. One of the first things he asked us to do was create a list of all the brands that we wanted to work with. And I'm like I love brands. I love working with big brands. I was a DDB guy for 8 or 9 years. I worked with Cassette, and I always loved working with the big brands. I've worked with Netflix and Lamborghini and Four Seasons, and so with Jar, I wanted to work with the big brands. And so he said, "Great, tell me the big brands you want to work with. Let's create a list, and then let's start to target them." And I guess in hindsight, it was sort of an ABM type strategy, but really it was just cold calling and just following up and doing all the legwork. We eventually got a sort of a HubSpot type program going where we had email sequences and things like that, but a lot of it was just grinding, hitting the phones. But it wasn't that he was completely on his own, and I think this is really important. And I often, when some agency owners say to me like, "Why did you hire a salesperson? Like you should be in sales." Like I totally see what they're saying. But I was still very, very, very much involved in the sales. And so he would do the initial outreach. He'd have a discovery call, but then usually on the next call, I would be involved or my partner Jen would be involved. And we would be the sort of the candy coating on his, on his conversation. And that I think played a big role in it as well, as we're small enough to have the founders be a part of the conversation, but also we were so passionate about what we were doing that they just couldn't help but feel that enthusiasm as well.
Yeah.
And then also, this part's super controversial, but we gave away some ideas for free. Like it's one of those things where at the time, again, podcasting was new. And we were asking some of these big brands to shift budget away from, TV or radio at the time, or different campaigns, and put it in a podcast. And it was like, I can't even envision what this could possibly even be, because there wasn't a lot of shows you could point to and say, it should be like that. So we had to kind of show them. We had to give away some early ideas to say, like, hey, it's, we're sort of thinking of a show like this, like, kind of close your eyes, imagine it sounds like this and this. And I mean, I know that's a very controversial topic, and I don't entirely love it, but we just kind of had to do it, because otherwise it just was not coming to them as to what this could possibly be and why they should invest.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's so much to dig into there. First off, I was just lighting up that cold outreach was one of the first things you did, and that it worked so well, because that's what we're all about, doing it tastefully. Yeah. But I think, what we've seen is that it's changed a lot. So like the stuff that worked 10 years ago, doesn't work as well now. And now, like, a lot of our approaches are based on trust building and like commonalities and like partnerships, referrals, and that kind of thing. So I'd love if you could dig into that a little bit. Like, how has the playbook changed as you've evolved?
Yeah. So again, when we first started, the idea of a branded podcast was very new, and so we spent a ton of time educating the market. So it wasn't just sales; it was sales plus like a full education on what exactly a podcast is, what's an RSS feed, like how does this audio file get onto people's phones? It was very, very basic stuff. We spent a ton of energy doing that. And yeah, we had content that that shared. We had content that prospects could look at, but we also just did a lot of lunch and learns and having discovery calls, but actually going a lot deeper than usual. Well, fast forward to now, and also I should mention we had very little competition. Again, there wasn't many doing this at all because it was so new. Well, now that podcasts are so mainstream, COVID obviously put a huge, rocket behind it. We've gotten to a point where we have a ton of competition. And so now the conversation is less about education at all, to be honest, and more about, so it's less about why podcasts and now it's more about why JAR. And it's actually the reason why we recently went through a rebrand. We used to be called JAR Audio. Obviously, audio and video are now where podcasts are these days, and we've always been in video, and so we needed to make that change. But also, our way of positioning ourselves is to back to our original idea, which is treat these podcasts as real marketing tools. Like, this should actually move the needle for your brand, and so we have now moved into the sort of the traditional way of selling, which is, what is the business challenge that we're looking to solve for? And then what could a podcast do to solve for that challenge? Which I actually have a ton more fun doing, because it's just a lot more about the client and a lot more about their business and less about the vehicle itself. The vehicle is just the way to solve their challenge or take advantage of whatever opportunity they want to take advantage of. And so we've now changed our name to JAR Podcast Solution, because our shows are true, solutions to their challenges.
Yeah, that's super interesting. It kind of reminds me of like the Gene Schwartz, stages of market awareness. So it's gone from aware to more aware to like most aware, which is like where a lot of us end up, where you're just kind of skeptical towards all the type of solutions. Yeah, exactly. It probably conforms with crossing the chasm too, until your head explodes from all the different mental models.
Totally.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I think one thing that I'm hearing that's interesting is like, because I have the audience in my head and they're like, I want to hire the salesperson, but it sounds like the building blocks you guys had in place were that, for one, you started out niche by service. So it's not like you had constraints in place from the beginning, which is really big. Although you weren't niched by vertical, generally going after bigger companies for one specific, thing you're going to do to solve this problem, which makes things easier. And the other thing you had in place was a high level of involvement in the sales process, from like not divorced, not like abdicating from it, but being there from like the second call on. So I just want to like call that out. Is there anything else that you feel like made that work with an outside salesperson?
I think I think that the outside salesperson also, he was a bit more senior than us, and he had been in startups before, and I think that was big because he could then push us as founders to really sort of think about some of the things that we might be missing. He pointed out some of our blind spots, which was a blend of his experience in business, but also the conversations he was having with certain brands. And, it's the typical, or maybe not typical, but we had the luxury, again, being so early of prospects saying, do you do this? And do you do this? And do you do this? And truly, when we started noticing pattern, we started to say to ourselves, maybe we should do that, or maybe we shouldn't do that. Or so we really used him as a sounding board, but also, there was sort of a mentor aspect to it all. Obviously there's a huge benefit to him, in that the business grew, but at the same time, we got to really, it was almost like he was our sort of third party in a way, in that he was, it's like the reason you hire an agency. One of the reasons you hire an agency is for that sort of, outside perspective. And he was our outside perspective, now that I think of it, and in a lot of our, key decisions.
Yeah, that makes sense. One thing you said that was interesting is that it used to be why podcasts, and then now it's become why jar, and that you like the new thing better, like kind of selling based on what you guys do differently, which is surprising to me because I feel like most people would like having less competition and being able to sell on like, hey, these podcasts are great, like being there at the right time. I guess there's challenges to that too. But what do you like more about selling, what you guys do versus selling podcasts?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, on a personal level, I frankly have always loved the agency world for the sheer fact that you get to work with such a diverse clientele. Whether it's the type of people you work with, or whether it's the categories you work with, or it's the sizes of business you work with. And I think for us, we've always felt that a podcast is such a versatile medium for brands. It's not for every brand, but you can have a huge impact on your B2B business or B2C business, or using a podcast for internal purposes, just for staff. And so we love the idea, I love the idea of being able to, craft a show that's going to be truly of value to their specific audience, and in turn is going to positively impact the business. We talk about a podcast as being a gift for your audience, and in turn they're going to become more loyal, and then higher engagement, repeat customers, more sharing, things like that. And so we love the ability to be able to sit down with the client and understand sort of what exactly this show needs to do. We call it the job. What is the job that this podcast is meant to solve? And then we understand what the audience is. Who are we trying to reach? What do they care about? How and where do they listen or watch? Like, how are they consuming content? Because these, we can't just think of it as a podcast competing with other podcasts. It has to compete with reading on your Kindle, watching Netflix, playing video games. Like, this is me time, right? And so the audience, understanding who the audience is so key. And then the results. So what does success look like for this show, and how are we going to measure it? Now, what I just described happens to be the new sort of system that we put all of our shows through. We call it our JAR system. But each of those results, so each of the outcomes of that is going to be completely unique based on that. We don't do any packages. We don't do any like off the shelf podcast plans. Everything is completely I hate using the word bespoke, but everything is bespoke because every challenge is different.
Yeah, and I think the important distinction is like bespoke with a pretty strong constraint, which is that you're working in podcasts. You're not doing other stuff. Which brings me to my next question, which is that I think that specializing, which in my opinion is where all agencies are going to need to go to some degree. Whether they're doing it vertically or horizontally, takes a lot of discipline, right? So I think that one of the what I would imagine, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, is that as you started having these successes, it would be pretty easy for one of these big companies to say, like, can you do this other thing too? We have the money to pay you. So assuming that's true, can you talk about examples of things you've said no to?
Well, first of all, we have a clear list of verticals that we won't work in. Typically, it's weapons, politics, religion, because we don't want to pick sides. And we really don't want to be in the fossil fuel business. Although we are interested in brands that truly want to make a transition to more sustainable energy, and the podcast can be part of that storytelling. So we were very clear on sort of where the no-go businesses were, but then we also have very clear sort of brand personalities we want to work with and don't want to work with. So again, this is kind of part of the system, is we documented these things and put them on a spreadsheet and made it very clear to anybody who was within the company as to what sort of the ground rules are, and made it very, very clear with our salesperson as well, so he wasn't wasting his time chasing XYZ if we were just going to say no. But then we also have a matrix that we put all of our opportunities through, which is, and I hope I'm going to remember all three, but it's usually money, awards, or sort of creative opportunity, and then that sort of badge value. And this is something also I think was key for us when we were early, which is like we wanted to go after the big dogs, because we felt like if we could put them on our website, put them in decks, it showed not only that we were trustworthy and capable of working with some of the largest companies in the world, whether it's American Express or it's T-Mobile or Allianz, but also this was a legitimate industry, and this was a legitimate vehicle this was a legitimate marketing tool. So what we've with those three pieces in that sort of matrix, we need to at least have two in order to move forward with an opportunity. The money's got to be there, and it's a great creative opportunity, or it's a great creative opportunity, and this is the one that we don't like as much, but it's great creative opportunity, and it's a great brand to be able to promote and talk about and put on our website, or it's a great brand and the money is great. So we want to at least have two of them on there. But we've said a lot. We've said no a lot. We've also made some mistakes and taken on different projects that we thought it's so hard. We find it to be very difficult to prejudge whether a project is going to be smooth or not. But we've worked with big companies that just didn't have the creative bravery within them to do anything of substance and actually create a show that's going to build an audience and move the needle for the brand. But on paper, you would never have thought that. And so you make those mistakes, and then you start to recognize patterns, and you say to yourself, like, well, this seems a lot like X, Y, and Z brand, and we made that mistake once. Let's not do it again. And so, we've been lucky enough to work with like so many of them that we have that sort of data. But also a lot of it comes down to just trust in your gut.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One kind of just quick sidebar is, how are you typically sourcing hosts? Are you finding somebody in the company? Are you like enlisting actors? And that seems like one of the tougher things to get alignment on.
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, it's a great question. And it's one of the services that we do for our clients. Typical marketer answer, it depends. So, if it is somebody within the organization, we want to be really careful who that person is. Ideally, it's not the CEO. For a couple of reasons. One is they have a tendency to just talk about the brand, and nobody wants to listen to a podcast that's all about the brand. They want to listen to a podcast that's made for them, that just happens to be brought to you by that brand. The other problem with the CEO is like they're just really busy. And we find that our production schedule just goes off the rails because they all of a sudden have to fly to, Davos, or they've got to attend, X, Y, and Z crisis. And those are all things that happen in a CEO's life. So if it's somebody within the organization, we want them to be, first of all, great talkers. We want them to be interesting, but also very audience focused. If it's somebody outside of the organization, yes, sometimes we'll hire actors. Mostly we'll hire, I would call more like personalities. They could be a comic, could be an influencer. But a lot of the times what we find is really great and also more cost effective is to find either a journalist or an academic. They're fantastic at obviously digging deep into the subject and topics, but also they're used to interrogating certain issues, but also having conversations about it in an interesting way. Because it's one thing to, talk on a microphone. It's another thing to actually conduct an interview. As you know, Dan, you're doing a great job, but it's not something you pick up overnight, right? So we, if we do work with somebody who has no experience do that, we do actually train them and we put them through some sort of role play type scenarios, and we'll throw some curveballs their way. But, at the end of the day, we just want them to be engaging, interesting, very audience first, but also willing to take some chances and maybe, disagree on some things. And this is where the relationship with the brand comes in. And this is, again, why we see our value as being that middleman in sort of, between between the host and the brand. We want the brand to obviously feel comfortable from a brand safety standpoint, but also the more interesting the conversation, the better the show, the better the engagement rate. Yeah. And that's actually, looking at the numbers, like that's the key metric for us is listen through rate for the most part, engagement. We want listeners to be listening for as long as possible. And so we aim for 80 to 90% of every episode listened through, which is pretty much unmatched in any other medium in marketing these days. Because, I can get you hundreds of thousands of listeners,
Yep.
But if they're only listening for 30 seconds, like what is that really doing for the brand? But if I can get you 5,000 listeners that are listening for 90% of every episode, a lot of our clients, we are able to report to them that every month, each audience member spends hours listening to their show, i.e. hours spent with their brand, which, makes them super happy.
Yeah.
That's a long time.
For sure. That makes sense. And I can see that being like a thing to sort of negotiate with them, because they probably have different opinions on who they want to run it. So kind of back to, so you talked about the success you had hiring the salesperson early on. Can you talk about how things look now? Like how has it evolved? Maybe like how you're thinking about the team and who's doing what in the sales and new business process these days?
Yeah. So from a sales and new business process, it's myself. I still do a lot of outreach, a lot of cold outreach, whether it's LinkedIn or email. I still like to target specific brands and find the right contacts. I use Apollo to find the right contact information. I'll set up sequences in Apollo, which I also sort of dovetail with LinkedIn. And really, I just want to get people on the phone and have conversations about, have a conversation about what's possible. The lucky thing is that a lot of people love talking podcasts. And so at minimum, we're going to have a really interesting conversation about podcasts and how they can impact the brand. But also just as a medium, just as a whole. So I still do a lot of outreach. We get a lot of inbound. I wouldn't say we get as much as I'd like. And that's stuff that we're working on just from like an SEO perspective. And now we're thinking about, AI and sort of how we format our content so that we appear in different, AI searches. We're also, we also do a lot of, produce a lot of content. We attend events. We really just want to be on the top of people. I'm a firm believer that there's very little, cold selling I can do to convince, CMO to start a podcast like right away.
Yeah.
Maybe, that was happening a lot more, 7-8 years ago, but now I think it's I think that the research that was done by what's it called, the Blassenberg industry or Blassenberg uh, group and LinkedIn. I think it's Byron Sharp and they essentially said that B2B advertising is meant to just has to be about awareness, and so you want to be one of the brands that CMO thinks of when it comes time for them to do a podcast. And so that's really our focus from a marketing perspective, is just a lot of awareness, so that when it is time to do a show, we get the inbound email. We're seeing a little bit more RFPs than we did in the past. That's a good thing and a bad thing, as we all know about RFPs.
Yeah.
We're also seeing a lot of, so this is, again, the evolution of the industry is brands have done a show already. They've already done the podcast thing, and they've now learned from it. They've learned what not to do, what to do. Did the show work? Did it not work? And so now we're getting the inbound where it's like, hey, we need you to fix what's broken, or we want to start something brand new and fresh, and this is what we don't want it to be. So that's really different. And then we also,
because sorry to cut you off. I was going to say it mirrors our journey so much. Where in the early years we were selling the idea of like, hey, you can reach out to your prospects instead of just waiting for them to find you, and then we kept seeing how skeptical markets got, and how the stages of awareness change, and also more like fly by night lead gen companies came in, and then. But like two things evolved. From one, our positioning had to evolve because people just didn't trust anybody saying that somebody else could get them leads. But also what it took to get leads, because we're in a weird space where it's kind of both things at once, like how we sell ourselves and also what works. That also changed because of the level of skepticism, right? And now it's more about trust and de-risking relationships through specializing and commonalities and referrals and like all that sort of thing. So I find that interesting. Anyway, I don't know where you left off, but
no, that's great. I will say that you just triggered a thought in me, is that we did use a fly by night lead gen company, only focused on LinkedIn, and we found it to be successful. But then I think we started to see it sort of peter off a little bit. The purpose of them was to get a client on a discovery call, but again, it all came down to whether it was the right time. Were we literally hitting them at the right time, which is the challenge that I have. Like, I hate doing email sequences and shit like that. Like, it's part of my language, but producing quality content side of me, just a little bit of me dies every time I do it. But then I also feel like it's got to do something just from a pure awareness standpoint, which is why I've actually sort of changed the messaging from like, hey, let's jump on a call and talk about what's possible for you. And now it's more like, hey, I don't want anything from you. I just want to get on your radar, so that when the day comes, you know who to contact. And so I think that's working. I'm really not great at the data side of our marketing, just on a brand level. Like I'm so bad at that. Like if you were to like put a gun to my head and say like what works better than others, I'd probably say LinkedIn, but I couldn't actually prove that to you. I don't have the focus I have the ability, but I just don't, to like sit down and look at a spreadsheet of like where our leads come from and stuff like that. And I know that's not a good thing to do, but I mostly do, email and LinkedIn.
It's funny. I agree with everything you're saying. I think that like outbound has become a lot more of like a private ad network than anything else. And then really like where we're seeing the most meetings come from is through targeted campaigns that have some sort of costly signal attached, like, hey, we just went to this event and perhaps you were there, or we have this person in common, or I got referred to you from somebody. That's where the actual like trust building meetings come from. But then cold outbound is just what you're saying. It's an awareness platform.
I will tell you something interesting. And again, this is probably going to be controversial. But we've started doing a thing where I'll be reading, Morning Brew or something like that. And I'll see an article about Albertsons, and it'll be about, them creating content to serve their family of customers and all this sort of stuff. Anyways, there'll be like a nugget in there, something that just will catch my attention. And I'll send it to my partner, Jen, who is a wizard when it comes to just developing podcast concepts. And I'll say, what can you do with this? And I'll just literally just leave it with her. I won't even give it a proper brief. I'll literally just send her the article, and she'll take it for a couple of days and then send me back just a little paragraph of an idea of a show. And then what I'll do is I'll go into Apollo and I'll find the right people at Albertsons, and then I'll put together a sequence in Meet Albert, for LinkedIn outreach, where I say hey, this is going to be a weird outreach, but my partner and I have this really great idea for a grocery brand, and I'll give a little teaser of what it is. I'll be like, hey, would it be interesting to just jump on a call and I can share with you what it is? If not, no problem. We're going to talk to another grocery brand, that sort of thing. And actually got quite a bit of return on that effort.
Yeah.
Because first of all, there's sort of the mystery behind what exactly it is, but also it's clear that we've done our homework. I'm going to have some signals in there of maybe something tied back to the article I read, or at least it's, something going on within the organization. And yeah, so far so good.
Yeah, that's cool. I think that there's a way to do that where you can make it pretty clear that it's not an AI that's doing it, but that is getting harder and harder because they have more and more of these AI tools that are just recreating a message that we can see through. But there's still things you can do, and I'm glad to hear that's working. And I think the lesson from that is that this doesn't have to be fancy. You don't have to be using AI just for the sake of using AI. You don't have to have a spreadsheet. I think the important thing is that you have the consistency and the time, devoted to it. Which brings me to another question. You mentioned more and more RFPs. I'm sure you have a lot going on. I think one of the biggest challenges for our clients and others is balancing the time for prospecting and not just getting stuck in hey, the RFP came in, we're heads down, but then tomorrow's opportunities aren't being nurtured. Mm-hmm. How do you like to divide up your week and make time for all this stuff?
Yeah, it's no. It's a great question, and I would probably say I'm not as good at it as I should be. At least from a nurturing standpoint, I'm not as good as I should be. We use Pipedrive. We abandoned HubSpot about a year and a half ago. I just couldn't. I couldn't stand the user experience, and I just found it to be more than we needed. And so we use Pipedrive now, and it's got a very clear funnel. I'm not as good as it as I should be. Mostly because my brain just is too scattered. I don't have time that I set aside to put the effort in. It is sort of when my brain is in that sort of mood. What I am constantly doing though is prospecting. If I'm reading articles and I'm plucking names out of different stories, or I'm finding reasons to have conversations with some of these brands. So I am constantly doing that. Whether it's sort of vertical focused, I will sometimes do that, or it's just there was a period of time where we used Winmo, and that was interesting because it was able to bubble up certain CMO moves or different stories in the industry. But quite honestly, a lot of times I'm reading Ad Age and Adweek and all the different publications to see just what's happening in brand world. And if I start to notice a pattern of certain brands in certain storytelling pockets, I'll find a reason to reach out to them and reference that. I am just a student of business as a whole, so I just am constantly reading and listening to podcasts, and the certain stories that jump out to me are the ones that we want to be working with anyways. And so it's just it's just a constant sort of running tally in my head of who I should be reaching out to. But I wouldn't say it's as systemized as it should be. But I kind of like it that way, because then it's more about like us. It's less about like us throwing ourselves on the problem versus us finding some of these challenges out there that these brands are having, and starting with that, and us being the solution, if that makes sense.
It does. And I think that systems are kind of a means to an end. Like they're basically there to help create consistency. So if you can find that consistency some other way, then so be it, and it sounds like you've done that.
The other thing, just one thing we do have a great system of is in my SLT meeting that we do once a week, we do have a clear section for sales, and I'll update my senior leadership team on, different sales efforts, because it is truly I wouldn't say it's an all agency effort, but it is definitely an all leadership team effort. My head of delivery helps me with my proposals. My partner Jen helps me with preparing the proposals and writing and all that sort of stuff. And then my head of operations is working with me on pricing and things like that. And so that piece of it is quite systemized. And I would say that we very rarely drop balls, if that makes sense. Not only because we use Pipedrive, and I have a system where I put something into Pipedrive and it updates my leadership team on the new entry, so that they're at least aware that this exists. Like, oh, Roger had a conversation with Airbnb. That's great. Doesn't mean we have to do anything about it right now, but it's good to just have in the back of our mind. Sometimes it springs a thought like, oh, I actually know somebody there, or like, oh, I stayed in one recently and I always thought like it'd be really great to do this podcast on, XYZ. So that piece of it, I feel, is incredibly powerful for us to sort of be all in from a team standpoint.
Yeah, especially given like the resources involved in proposals and how sideways that can go. So that makes a lot of sense. Roger, kind of getting towards the end of our time, what are you excited about over the next few months?
Honestly, the new rebrand, the new positioning for JAR, very much focused on the results that we're able to deliver for our clients. We're excited to work with agencies as well. We don't just work direct with brands. We oftentimes will partner with agencies. We white label. We very much want the agency and their creative team to be at the table. We don't sort of take it out of their hands, sort of thing. So I'm excited to just create more relationships that way. If anyone wants to learn more about us or reach out, they can go to jarpodcast.com and you can see exactly who we are, what we stand for, some of the work we've done, and how to reach out.
Awesome. Roger, thank you so much. This has been great.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, everyone.